Imagine, if you will, the cool marble floors of a Roman villa, not a place of comfort anymore, but of quiet tension. The great baths are silent, the forums are less crowded, and even the statues of forgotten emperors seem to gaze out with a sense of weariness. It is the late 5th century, and the long, slow, gentle process of decline is well underway. The sun, as it sets over the hills, seems to cast longer shadows than it used to. The air carries the scent of dust and change, a kind of melancholic stillness that precedes a great storm. A storm not of wind and rain, but of new peoples, new languages, and new ways of life. For centuries, the Roman Empire in the West has been a constant, a sprawling, seemingly eternal entity. Yet its strength has been ebbing away like the tide, pulled by forces it no longer fully comprehended. The sound you hear is not a crash, but a slow, continuous unraveling, a thread being pulled from a vast tapestry until the entire thing begins to come apart. You can almost feel the chill in the air, a different kind of cold than the Roman citizens were used to. It's the chill of uncertainty, a sense that the world they knew, the one built on laws and legions, was about to be remade entirely. Did you know that the final Roman emperor of the West was just a boy, a quiet footnote in the grand story? His name was Romulus Augustulus, and his short reign marked the very end of an era. The year was 476, and an unassuming Germanic chieftain named Odoacer simply decided to take over. He didn't burn Rome, he just sent the little emperor away to live in a quiet castle, and for all intents and purposes, the story of the Western Roman Empire was over. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You can even post your location and local time, and maybe we can see how far this story travels. The formal end of the Western Roman Empire was more of a quiet sigh than a dramatic finale. Odoacer, a German general in the Roman army, had become so powerful that he had his own men, and the Roman emperors were just puppets anyway. By the time he deposed Romulus Augustulus, it hardly mattered to most people. The Roman state had already been hollowed out from within, weakened by internal conflicts, economic troubles, and the constant pressure of migrating peoples along its borders. It was less of a conquest and more of a handover. Odoacer ruled Italy for a while, but his time in charge was relatively short and peaceful. He maintained much of the Roman administrative structure, and life, for many, continued much as it had before. The grand buildings might have looked a little more worn, and the once great roads a little more overgrown, but the rhythm of daily life persisted. Odoacer's rule, however, was not meant to last. From the east came another group, the Ostrogoths, led by a remarkably capable king named Theodoric. Theodoric had grown up in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and had a deep respect for Roman culture and administration, even as he was a king of a Gothic people. He was sent by the Eastern Emperor to remove Odoacer, and after a series of campaigns, he did just that. Theodoric established the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and for a time it was an island of relative stability in a sea of change. He tried to create a society where Goths and Romans could live side by side, with the Goths handling the military and the Romans managing the administration. It was a fascinating experiment in cultural coexistence. He repaired aqueducts, built magnificent churches, and even revived a bit of the old Roman public works. One of his most famous structures is the Mausoleum of Theodoric in Ravenna, a rather striking building topped with a single massive stone lid that had to be floated into place. A person might wonder how they managed such a feat without a modern crane, and the answer is always a bit of clever engineering, a lot of brute force, and probably a few whispered prayers. His rule was, for the most part, a period of calm and prosperity. However, the delicate balance he had created relied entirely on his own charisma and skill. When he died in 526, the kingdom began to unravel. His successors were not as capable, and the relationship between the Goths and the Romans started to fray. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Justinian, saw this as his opportunity. He was a man with a grand vision, a desire to restore the glory of the old Roman Empire, and Italy was the crown jewel of that ambition. He launched a military campaign to reclaim the peninsula, a conflict that would become known as the Gothic War. This was not the quiet, polite handover that had marked the end of the Western Empire. This was a brutal, destructive war that would rage for almost 2 decades. The Gothic War devastated Italy, destroying cities, farms, and the very infrastructure that Theodoric had tried so hard to preserve. The fighting was fierce, with cities changing hands multiple times. The people of Italy suffered immensely. The once fertile land was laid to waste, and famine became a constant companion. The peace and relative prosperity that Theodoric had built were completely shattered. The peninsula was exhausted and depopulated by the time the Byzantines finally emerged victorious. Historians still debate whether Theodoric's rule was a genuine attempt at a new peaceful fusion of cultures or simply a clever political strategy to maintain power. Either way, the experiment was a short-lived one. The Byzantines, with their renewed control, didn't bring the stability the exhausted population so desperately needed. Instead, their rule was often distant and overtaxing. The empire in Constantinople was vast, and Italy was just one of its many provinces. They were more interested in extracting resources and taxes than in rebuilding the shattered land. The seeds of what was to come were already being sown. A new wave of invaders, the Lombards, was waiting in the wings. They were a fierce Germanic people who had been pushed from their traditional lands and were looking for a new home. The war-torn and exhausted state of Italy made it an inviting target, a country with little will or strength left to resist. The slow unraveling was about to get a lot faster. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Italy's long and tangled history. The quiet exhaustion that had settled over Italy after the Gothic War was not destined to last. It was more of a holding of breath, a brief pause before a fresh and even more dramatic act began. As the Byzantine empires attempted to solidify its control, the Lombards were moving. These were a Germanic people, tough and pragmatic, who had been migrating from the north for a long time. In 568, under the leadership of a king named Alboin, they crossed the Julian Alps and poured into Italy. Unlike the Goths, who had entered with a degree of imperial permission, the Lombards were simply an invading force. They came not to rule alongside the existing population, but to take and settle. The weary, depopulated peninsula still scarred by 2 decades of war, offered little resistance. The Byzantine garrisons were stretched thin and poorly supplied, and the local population had no energy left for a fight. The Lombard invasion was not a single, unified conquest. They swept down the peninsula, but they didn't manage to take everything. Italy became a patchwork of power, a political mosaic that would define its history for centuries. The Lombards established their kingdom in the north, with their capital in Pavia, and carved out powerful duchies, like those of Spoleto and Benevento, in the south. However, the Byzantines managed to hold on to a few crucial coastal areas and cities, including Ravenna, Rome, Naples, and a sliver of land that would later become Venice. This left Italy in a state of permanent fragmentation, a land with no single master. The lines on the map were not solid, but dotted, with Byzantine islands surrounded by a Lombard sea. It was a situation ripe for endless squabbles and conflicts. The Lombards, for their part, were a very different kind of ruler than the Goths had been. They were less interested in preserving the old Roman ways and more in imposing their own. They brought their own legal codes and administrative traditions, which were a bit simpler, a bit less refined, and often a bit more direct. This created a profound cultural shift in the areas they controlled. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new power was quietly growing, a force that was not a king or an emperor, but a bishop. With the Byzantine presence distant and often disinterested, the popes of Rome began to fill the political vacuum. They were the one constant in the city, the one institution that had not crumbled. The popes had immense moral authority, and as the old Roman government faded, they started taking on secular responsibilities, organizing food relief, negotiating with Lombard invaders, and even building up rudimentary defenses. The papacy, under men like Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century, evolved from a purely spiritual office into a powerful temporal authority. Gregory, for example, organized the defense of Rome when it was threatened by a Lombard siege, and he used the church's vast landholdings to provide for the poor. He was a shrewd diplomat, a capable administrator, and a man who understood that in this new world, the church had to be a political player to survive. His letters and his actions show him to be a person of immense practicality. One might even call him a chief executive officer of the Roman world, at least of the small part that was left. The relationship between the papacy and the Lombards was a complicated one. Sometimes they were at peace, but often they were in conflict. The popes saw the Lombards as a constant threat to their independence and to the remaining Byzantine territories. They were, in the words of one exasperated pope, a detestable people. This fear and this ambition would have enormous consequences for the future of Italy. The pope, isolated and under pressure, began to look for a new ally, a new protector to replace the Byzantines. That new protector would eventually be found in the powerful Frankish kingdom to the north, a Germanic people who had converted to Nicene Christianity, the same branch of the faith as the popes themselves. This shared faith created a bond, a strategic alliance that would eventually reshape the entire map of Europe. The Lombards, in their piecemeal conquest, had unwittingly set the stage for their own downfall. They had created a fragmented Italy which prevented them from ever truly consolidating power, and they had pushed the papacy into the arms of a new, formidable friend. The Byzantine territories, though diminished, became crucial safe havens for culture and learning. Ravenna, for example, remained a center of art and administration, where mosaics and architecture continued to be produced in the Byzantine style. The city of Venice, which was just a collection of islands in a lagoon at this point, used its Byzantine connection to develop its maritime trade, creating a foundation for its future commercial empire. The period of Lombard rule, which lasted for over 2 centuries, was a time of immense political and social transformation. The Roman infrastructure continued to decay, and the grand urban-centric society of the past was replaced by a more decentralized rural one, organized around local lords and powerful dukes. The memory of a unified Italy, once a reality under Rome, was slowly fading into legend. Historians still argue about the precise reasons for the success of the Lombard invasion. Was it due to the utter devastation and exhaustion of Italy after the Gothic Wars, the internal weakness of the Byzantine Empire, or simply the ferocity and determination of the Lombards themselves? The truth, as is so often the case, is probably a bit of all three. Italy was a land in search of a new identity, and the Lombards had arrived to help, whether the locals wanted it or not. With Italy fragmented and the Lombard kingdom established, a new sort of stasis settled over the peninsula. The Lombards ruled from their capital at Pavia, but their power was a collection of semi-independent duchies, a testament to their initial piecemeal conquest. The Duchy of Spoleto in the center and Benevento in the south acted almost like separate kingdoms, often pursuing their own policies and even their own alliances. This political structure was a far cry from the centralized authority of the old Roman Empire, and it meant that Italy was never a single, unified power. This fragmentation would be a recurring theme for centuries to come, a kind of historical echo that would shape everything that followed. The Lombards themselves, at first, were Arian Christians, a branch of the faith that was considered heretical by the papacy in Rome and the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. This religious difference added a layer of distrust to their political conflicts. However, over time, the Lombards began to convert to Nicene Christianity, the faith of Rome. This slow but steady process of conversion was often influenced by their Roman subjects and by the persistent diplomatic efforts of the popes. The conversion removed one of the main ideological barriers between the Lombards and the papacy, but it didn't solve their political disagreements. The popes still feared Lombard ambition and their desire to conquer the last remaining Byzantine lands, including Rome itself. The papacy, remember, had grown in temporal power out of necessity. It had organized the defense of Rome, fed its people, and acted as a diplomatic broker. This practical power, combined with its immense spiritual authority, made the Pope a unique figure in the political landscape of Italy and Europe. A key turning point was a document that historians now know to be a forgery, but at the time was taken as genuine truth. It was called the Donation of Constantine, and it was a supposedly ancient Roman imperial decree. The document claimed that the Emperor Constantine the Great had gifted the Pope temporal authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire as a thank you for curing him of leprosy. This was, of course, a complete fiction, but it was used by the papacy to justify its growing secular power and its claims to a broad swath of land in central Italy. This territory, which came to be known as the Papal States, created a physical buffer between the northern and southern parts of the peninsula and cemented the Pope's role as a territorial prince. The Papal States were a powerful entity in the centuries that followed, a kind of ecclesiastical kingdom with its own armies, laws, and diplomatic corps. This made the Pope not just a religious leader, but a major political player with a vested interest in the balance of power in Italy. This is a crucial point to remember because the Pope's dual role, spiritual and temporal, would be a source of endless conflict for a very long time. As the Lombards eyed the Papal States, the popes looked to the north, to the rising power of the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic people who had established a powerful kingdom in what is now France and Germany. They were firm allies of the papacy, and they saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Roman legacy. In 751, a new Frankish dynasty, the Carolingians, rose to power. The Frankish king, Pepin the Short, was a devoted supporter of the Pope. When the Lombards threatened Rome, the Pope appealed to Pepin for help. Pepin came, defeated the Lombards, and in a gesture known as the Donation of Papa, he formally granted the Papal States to the Pope, taking lands that had belonged to the Lombards and the Byzantines and giving them to the papacy. This act was monumental. It established the Papal States as a legitimate sovereign entity. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, would take this relationship even further. The Lombards were now in a precarious position, sandwiched between the powerful Franks and the rising Papal States. They made one last desperate push under their final king Desiderius to unite the peninsula, but it was too late. Charlemagne, a man of immense ambition and military genius, answered the Pope's call for help and invaded Italy. He besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, and after a long and difficult siege, he finally conquered the city. The year was 774, and with the fall of Pavia, the Lombard kingdom in Italy effectively came to an end. Charlemagne took the title of King of the Lombards, but he didn't rule the kingdom in the same way. He integrated it into his growing Frankish empire, allowing some of the old Lombard dukes to remain in power as his vassals. The northern and central parts of Italy, for the first time in centuries, were under the control of a single, powerful ruler. However, the south remained a jumble of Lombard, Byzantine, and independent territories. The Papal States, thanks to their Frankish alliance, were now safe from Lombard aggression. The stage was set for the next dramatic turn of events, one that would cement the power of the Franks and create a new kind of empire. This period marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, where Italy is no longer just a collection of warring duchies, but is about to be woven into the fabric of a larger, more ambitious European project. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind the donation of Constantine, and whether it was a deliberate forgery created to serve a specific political purpose. Most now agree that it was. With the Lombard kingdom subdued, the stage was set for the most famous act of this long, quiet drama. On Christmas Day in the year 800, in the ancient St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, A scene of immense historical significance unfolded. The Pope, Leo III, a man who owed his very position to the Frankish king, placed a crown on the head of Charlemagne. As the crown settled, the people gathered in the church, and perhaps a few angels in the rafters shouted in unison, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." With that single act, a new empire was born, the Carolingian Empire, a successor to the old Roman order. It was a new Roman Empire, but this time it was a German one, and it was tied directly to the papacy. The coronation of Charlemagne was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a political statement. It created a powerful new relationship between the Pope and the Emperor, a relationship that was both a source of strength and, as we'll see, of endless conflict. The Emperor was now the protector of the Church, and the Pope was the spiritual authority who could bestow the ultimate temporal power. Charlemagne's empire was vast, stretching from Spain to modern-day Germany, and from the North Sea down into central Italy. He was a remarkable figure, a man of immense physical stature and intellectual curiosity. He was a great warrior, a shrewd administrator, and a patron of learning. He presided over a period of cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. In Italy, his rule brought a new kind of stability, though it was still a foreign one. He reorganized the Lombard territories, giving power to his Frankish counts and dukes, but he largely kept the Lombard laws and administrative traditions in place. This was a man who understood that you can't just erase history, you have to work with it. His great palace school at Aachen attracted scholars from all over Europe, including a number of Italians, and his efforts to promote education and literacy had a lasting impact. One of the most famous scholars of the era was Alcuin of York, who was Charlemagne's chief advisor on educational matters. He was a fascinating person who, among other things, developed a new, more legible form of writing called Carolingian minuscule, which is the ancestor of the lowercase letters we use today. The reality, of course, was never as neat as the grand pronouncements. Charlemagne's rule in Italy was not total. The south remained a complex and chaotic mix of powers. The Lombard Duchy of Benevento, in particular, managed to hold on to a large degree of independence. The Byzantines still held on to coastal cities, like Naples and the area around Venice. The Muslims from North Africa were also starting to make their presence felt, launching raids on Sicily and the southern coasts. Italy was still a political chessboard with many players. Charlemagne's coronation also created a deep-seated tension with the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They considered themselves the one and only true successors to the Roman Empire and viewed Charlemagne as a usurper. For a long time, they refused to recognize his imperial title, and this disagreement would simmer for centuries, a silent feud between two halves of a fractured empire. The Mediterranean was a place of intrigue and competition, and Italy was right in the middle of it. Charlemagne's death in 814 marked the beginning of the end for the unified Carolingian Empire. His successors were not as capable as he was, and the vast empire was too difficult to manage and hold together. It was eventually divided among his grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and with each successive generation, the empire became more and more fragmented. This fragmentation was especially pronounced in Italy. The great imperial authority began to weaken, and local lords, dukes, and counts began to assert their own power. The once unified Kingdom of Italy, now part of the Carolingian Empire, started to break apart into smaller and smaller pieces. The political landscape of Italy began to look a lot like it had before the Franks arrived, a mess of competing local powers. The memory of Charlemagne's strong rule faded, and a period of political chaos, often called the Dark Ages, of Italy set in. Historians still argue about the true nature of Charlemagne's coronation. Was it a spontaneous event, or was it a carefully planned maneuver by both Charlemagne and the Pope to legitimize a new power structure in Europe? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The act served both their interests, and whether by designs or by chance, it created a new political order that would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years. Also, with the passing of Charlemagne, a palpable sense of instability began to settle over Italy. The grand idea of a unified Carolingian empire was simply too vast to be maintained by his less capable successors. The political reality was that power was already being decentralized. The emperors, now more focused on their squabbles north of the Alps, had less and less time or energy to devote to the Italian peninsula. The result was a political free-for-all, a period of fragmentation and localized power struggles that would last for over a century. This was a time when the person you owed your allegiance to was not a distant emperor, but the local count or marquess, a man who could actually protect you from a marauding band of Vikings or a rival lord. The old Carolingian administrative structure, with its counts and missi dominici, or envoys of the Lord, began to break down. These offices became hereditary, turning what was once a temporary appointment into a permanent personal fiefdom. The great families of Italy seized this opportunity. Powerful noble houses, like the Dukes of Spoleto or the Marquesses of Tuscany and Friuli, began to act with increasing independence. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and made their own alliances. This was a time of endless, low-grade warfare and political maneuvering. The title of King of Italy became a sort of prize to be fought over, a temporary position that changed hands frequently among these powerful families. It was a chaotic and confusing time, and it made the people of Italy, a population that was still primarily rural, look for a new source of stability. They found it in two places: the church and the growing, vibrant cities. The church, with its lands and its powerful bishops, was often the only institution that could provide any semblance of order. Bishops became not just spiritual leaders, but also powerful temporal rulers, governing their cities with the authority of a prince. At the same time, the cities of Italy, with their ancient Roman foundations, were beginning to stir. Places like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which had survived the Lombard invasion by virtue of their Byzantine connections, were quietly developing their own commercial and maritime strength. They were building their own fleets and trading with the Byzantine and Muslim worlds. This wealth gave them a kind of independence that the landlocked noble families could only dream of. The people of these cities, a mix of merchants, artisans, and sailors, had a common interest in protecting their trade routes and their liberty. They were not content to be ruled by a distant king or a feuding noble. The foundations of the future city-states were being laid brick by brick, ship by ship. This period of fragmentation, which may seem like a step backward, was in fact a crucial step in the development of a unique Italian identity. Unlike the rest of Europe, which was slowly coalescing into large, feudal kingdoms, Italy was breaking into 1,000 different pieces, each with its own character and its own destiny. The chaos of this period was compounded by a new wave of invasions from the outside. The Vikings, in their longboats, raided the coasts of northern Italy, and the Saracens, as the Muslims of North Africa were known, were a constant threat in the south. The Saracens, in fact, established a number of strongholds on the coast, including one in southern France, from which they launched devastating raids on the surrounding countryside. This constant external pressure only made the local lords and cities more determined to fend for themselves. The absence of a strong central authority forced them to develop their own means of defense and governance. The old saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention, and in this case, the necessity of survival in a chaotic world led to the invention of a new kind of political entity. This was also the time when the old idea of the Holy Roman Empire was revived, though not in the same glorious way as under Charlemagne. A new German dynasty, the Ottonians, came to power in the mid-10th century, and its most famous member, Otto I, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome in 962. This event is often seen as the beginning of the true Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, decentralized German state that would nominally rule over much of Central Europe, including northern Italy, for 1,000 years. But the new emperors, like their Carolingian predecessors, were often distant figures. Their control over Italy was more theoretical than real, and they had to constantly come to the peninsula with their armies to enforce their authority. The popes in Rome, who crowned these emperors, had their own political agenda, and the great noble families of Italy continued to play them all against each other. It was a very complicated game of thrones, with the popes, the Holy Roman emperors, and the powerful Italian nobles all vying for supremacy. Historians still argue whether the renewed Holy Roman Empire was a legitimate continuation of Roman authority or just a clever name for a new Germanic power. As the authority of the Holy Roman emperors faded, a new kind of power was quietly, almost imperceptibly, rising in the Italian peninsula. This was not the power of kings or emperors, but of cities themselves. In the absence of a strong central government, the Italian cities began to govern themselves. They were the heirs of the old Roman urban tradition, centers of population and commerce that had never fully died out, even during the darkest days of the invasions. They were also at the crossroads of major trade routes, with goods flowing from the Byzantine east and the Islamic south, and this commerce made them rich. It was a kind of power born not from military conquest, but from economic necessity and a shared desire for self-preservation. The most famous of these burgeoning city-states were Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These were the great maritime republics. Venice, in particular, was in a league of its own. Built on a series of islands in a lagoon, it was a city of canals. not streets, and its very geography made it almost impossible to conquer by land. It had remained loyal to the Byzantine emperor, at least in name, but in reality it was fiercely independent, a city of merchants and sailors who looked to the sea for their fortune. The Venetians used their fleet to trade in luxury goods like silks and spices with the East, and they grew incredibly wealthy in the process. Their government, a complex system of councils and a doge, or chief magistrate, was a kind of aristocratic republic, a unique political experiment that would last for 1,000 years. It was a far cry from the feudal system that was taking hold in the rest of Europe. Genoa and Pisa, on the western coast of Italy, were not as politically stable as Venice, but they were no less ambitious. They were rivals who often fought each other, but they were also united by their need to control the trade of the western Mediterranean. They both launched campaigns to drive out the Saracens from their island strongholds in Corsica and Sardinia, and in doing so, they secured their own trade routes and eliminated their biggest rivals. The naval victories over the Muslims gave them immense prestige and control of the seas. These two cities were at the forefront of a new kind of warfare, a naval war driven by trade and profit. The people of these cities, the merchants, shipbuilders, and sailors, were not a feudal class. They were a new, dynamic kind of citizen, and they were organized into what were called communes, self-governing associations of citizens. The rise of the communes was a slow, gradual process. At first, they were simply associations formed by the citizens to protect their interests from the local bishop or noble. Over time, these communes gained more and more power, eventually taking over the governance of the city itself. They would form their own councils, elect their own officials, and raise their own armies, usually composed of their own citizens. They created their own laws and, most importantly, their own unique sense of civic pride. The citizens of Florence, for example, would start to identify themselves not as subjects of a far-off emperor, but as Florentines. This was a completely new way of thinking about political identity. These city-states, with their vibrant economies and their new forms of government, became magnets for talent and a source of incredible creativity. They were places where a person's worth was not determined by their family name, but by their wealth and their skill. This was a dramatic break from the feudal tradition of the rest of Europe, where society was divided into a rigid hierarchy of lords, knights, and serfs. In the Italian cities, a clever merchant or a talented artisan could rise to a position of power and influence. They were the precursors to the modern concept of a republic, and they were powered by the incredible energy of their own people. The competition between these cities was fierce, and it would often lead to wars, but it also spurred them on to greater achievements. Historians still argue about whether the development of the city-states was a natural outgrowth of Roman urbanism or a completely new phenomenon born from the political chaos of the post-Carolingian era. While the north of Italy was seeing the rise of its powerful city-states, the south was undergoing a dramatic transformation of its own. It was a region with its own unique history, a land of ancient Greek settlements, Byzantine territories, and fragmented Lombard duchies. It was a complex and often chaotic mix of cultures and political powers. But this delicate balance was about to be completely upended by the arrival of a new force, a people who were about to demonstrate a knack for military prowess and political cunning that would reshape the entire region. These were the Normans, a group of people who had originally come from Scandinavia and had settled in northern France in a place we now call Normandy. They were a restless, adventurous people, known for their skill in battle and their willingness to seek their fortune in far-off lands. And in the 11th century, they began to arrive in southern Italy. They came at first not as a conquering army but as mercenaries, hired by the various Lombard and Byzantine rulers to fight their endless wars. But the Normans, with their superior fighting skills and their ambition, quickly realized that they were fighting for other people's land when they could be taking it for themselves. One of the most famous of these early Normans was Robert Guiscard, a man of immense physical stature and even greater ambition. His name, Guiscard, meant the wily one, and it was a name he earned. He was a master of political intrigue and a brilliant military strategist. He arrived in southern Italy with nothing more than a small band of followers, and through a series of ruthless campaigns and clever political maneuvers, he began to carve out a new kingdom for himself. He took on the Byzantine Empire, the Papal States, and the remaining Lombard dukes, and he defeated them all. The Pope, at first, was a great opponent of the Normans, but he eventually came to see them as a potential ally. In a move that showed just how desperate the papacy was for a new protector, Pope Nicholas II made an alliance with the Normans. He formally recognized their conquests, and in exchange, the Normans swore fealty to the Pope. This alliance was a stroke of genius for both sides. The Pope had a powerful new military force to protect him from his enemies, and the Normans had the papal blessing for their new kingdom. It was a beautiful example of two different kinds of power, the spiritual and the temporal, coming together for mutual benefit. Robert Guiscard and his brother, Roger I, went on to conquer Sicily from the Saracens, a campaign that lasted for over 30 years and was a testament to their incredible tenacity. The Muslims had held Sicily for over 2 centuries, and it was a land of immense wealth and culture. The Normans, once they had conquered it, created a unique society that was a blend of Latin, Greek, and Islamic cultures. The Norman kings of Sicily were remarkably tolerant. They employed Greek and Muslim administrators. They used Arabic and Greek in their court, and they built magnificent churches and palaces that were a fusion of all these different styles. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo is a perfect example of this unique blend of cultures, with its Byzantine mosaics and its Islamic-style muqarnas ceiling. The kings were a testament to the fact that you didn't have to destroy a culture to rule it. You could, in fact, embrace it and make it your own. The Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily resulted in the creation of the Kingdom of Sicily, a powerful, centralized state that would last for centuries. This was in stark contrast to the fragmented north, with its city-states and its squabbling nobles. The Normans brought a kind of political unity to the south that had not been seen since the days of the Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Sicily, with its rich and varied cultural heritage, became one of the most powerful and prosperous states in all of Europe. The kings, like Roger II, ruled from their capital at Palermo with a kind of absolute authority that was very different from the self-governing communes of the north. The Normans, in a span of just a few generations, had gone from being landless adventurers to the masters of one of the richest kingdoms in the world. Their story is a perfect example of how a small, ambitious group of people can, with a bit of luck and a lot of courage, completely rewrite the history of a region. Historians still argue about whether the Normans were a force for enlightened, tolerant rule, or if their cultural tolerance was just a pragmatic way to manage their diverse new subjects. While the Normans were busy consolidating their new kingdom in the south, a new and far-reaching conflict was brewing in the north of Italy and across the Alps. This was not a war of armies and sieges, but a war of ideas and authority, a long and bitter struggle for supremacy between the two great powers of the medieval world, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. It became known as the Investiture controversy. The name might sound a little dry, but the conflict itself was anything but. At its heart was a seemingly simple question: who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots? The Pope as the head of the church, or the Emperor as the most powerful temporal ruler? To understand why this was such a big deal, you have to remember that bishops and abbots were not just religious figures. They were also powerful feudal lords. They controlled vast amounts of land and wealth, and they commanded their own armies. They were, in essence, major political players. For the Holy Roman Emperors, the ability to appoint their own men to these positions was crucial for maintaining control over their vast and often unruly empire. They could appoint loyal supporters who would provide them with soldiers and taxes. For the Pope, however, the practice of lay investiture, or the appointment of church officials by a secular ruler, was a source of great outrage. They saw it as an unacceptable interference in the spiritual affairs of the church, a blatant violation of their divinely ordained authority. The popes believed that only they had the right to appoint the spiritual leaders of the church. The conflict came to a head in the late 11th century with a showdown between two of the most powerful figures of the age, Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Pope Gregory was a reformer, a man who believed that the church needed to be purified of secular influence. He issued a decree in 1075 that formally forbid lay investiture. Henry IV, who had just come to the throne, saw this as a direct challenge to his authority. He declared the Pope to be deposed. Gregory, not one to back down, excommunicated the emperor. Now, in our modern world, excommunication might not seem like such a big deal, but in the medieval world, it was a truly terrifying prospect. It meant that the emperor was, in the eyes of the church, no longer a Christian, and it released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. It was, in effect, a declaration of war. Henry's vassals, many of whom were already opposed to him, used the excommunication as an excuse to rebel. Henry IV, with his empire falling apart around him, had no choice but to humble himself. In the winter of 1077, he famously traveled to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope was staying. For 3 days, the emperor stood in the snow, barefoot and dressed in a hair shirt, a symbol of his repentance, waiting for the Pope to grant him an audience. It was an astonishing act of humility and a clear victory for the papacy. Pope Gregory eventually forgave him, but the conflict was far from over. It would simmer and flare up again for the next few decades, with popes and emperors trying to one-up each other in an endless struggle for power. The controversy was finally settled, at least for a time, by a compromise known as the Concordat of Worms in 1122. Under the terms of the Concordat, the emperor gave up his right to invest bishops with the ring and staff, the symbols of their spiritual office, but he retained the right to be present at the election and to invest the bishop with the secular lands and privileges that came with the office. It was a compromise that gave both sides a piece of what they wanted, but it also left the fundamental question of their relationship unresolved. The investiture controversy had a profound impact on Italy. It fueled the rise of the independent city-states, which often used the conflict between the Pope and the Emperor to assert their own autonomy. The cities could, for example, side with the Pope against the Emperor and gain concessions in the process. It also led to the development of the two great factions that would dominate Italian politics for centuries: the Guelphs, who were pro-papal, and the Ghibellines, who were pro-imperial. This conflict would be the backdrop for almost everything that happened in Italy for the next few hundred years, a kind of inherited family feud that would shape the destiny of every city and every person. It was a battle not just for power, but for the very soul of the medieval world. Historians still argue whether the investiture controversy was primarily a political power struggle or a genuine religious and moral crusade to reform the Church. As the great powers of the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire were locked in their struggle, a new kind of adventure was sweeping across Europe, one that would have profound and lasting consequences for the Italian city-states. This was the era of the Crusades. The first of these great expeditions to the Holy Land was launched in the late 11th century, a great outpouring of religious fervor and a somewhat less chivalrous desire for land and treasure. While knights and peasants from France and Germany made their long, arduous journey by land, the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa saw an immense opportunity. They were not driven by the same kind of religious zeal, but they were more than happy to help. They were, after all, in the business of ships and trade. The Crusaders needed transport. They needed food and supplies. They needed a way to get their armies from Europe to the shores of the Middle East. And the Italian maritime republics were the only ones who had the fleets to do it. The Crusades became for them a fantastic business venture. They were the Uber of the medieval world, providing transportation and logistics for the great armies of God. They charged an enormous fee for their services, and in return for their help, they demanded and received commercial privileges in the newly conquered Crusader states. They got their own quarters in the port cities of the Holy Land, their own streets, their own docks, and their own laws. They were, in essence, carving out their own private, commercial empires on the coast of the Levant. Venice, with its immense fleet and its shrewd diplomacy, was particularly good at this. The Venetians were a little like the corporate executives of the Crusades. They would negotiate with the leaders of the Crusades, and they would play a long game. The most famous example of this was the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders were supposed to sail to the Holy Land, but they got into a bit of financial trouble. The Venetians, led by their sharp-witted doge, Enrico Dandolo, offered to transport them if they would first help them sack the Christian city of Zara, a Venetian rival. The Crusaders, a bit embarrassed and desperate, agreed. But the real goal was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Venice had a complicated relationship with the Byzantines, a bit of a friendly rivalry that had soured over the years. The Crusaders, with Venetian encouragement and logistics, sacked Constantinople in 1204. It was one of the most disgraceful acts of the Crusades, but for Venice, it was a magnificent business success. The city became an even more dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, with new territories and new trade routes to control. Genoa and Pisa were not far behind. They too established trading posts in the Holy Land, and they competed fiercely with each other and with Venice for control of the sea lanes. This competition often broke out into open warfare, with naval battles and commercial espionage. The Crusades, in a way, transformed the Italian maritime republics from just a collection of independent cities into true economic and naval powers. They became the masters of the Mediterranean, a kind of modern-day naval superpower. The wealth that flowed back into these cities was immense. It was used to build grand palaces, to commission magnificent works of art, and to fuel the growth of their populations. This wealth also gave them a kind of political and military independence from the Holy Roman Emperor, who was still, at least in theory, their overlord. The Crusades also led to a new kind of social and economic organization in the cities. The merchants and bankers of these cities, the people who financed and profited from the Crusades, became a new kind of aristocratic class. Their power was based on money and business acumen, not on inherited land. This was a radical break from the old feudal system. It was a kind of proto-capitalism, and it was all happening in the bustling, dynamic, and sometimes a little bit ruthless cities of Italy. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were a genuine religious movement, or if they were, in fact, a kind of grand medieval land grab that was secretly funded and supported by the Italian city-states for their own commercial gain. While the Italian city-states were busy building their commercial empires, a new kind of power was rising to challenge them. This power came not from a city, but from an emperor, a man who saw himself as the true successor to the Roman and Carolingian empires. His name was Frederick II, a figure of such brilliance and complexity that he was known to his contemporaries as the Stupor Mundi, or Wonder of the World. Frederick was born in 1194, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and Constance, the Norman Queen of Sicily. This dual heritage made him a unique figure. He was a German emperor, but he was also the king of the Normans' rich and culturally diverse kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. He spoke 6 languages, was a patron of science and art, and kept a menagerie of exotic animals, including elephants and leopards, at his court in Palermo. Frederick's reign was a long, complicated, and often bloody struggle. His main goal was to re-establish the imperial authority in Italy, to bring the unruly and fiercely independent city-states of the north under his control, and to rule over a unified Italy from his base in Sicily. This brought him into direct and bitter conflict with the papacy, which saw a strong, unified imperial power in Italy as a direct threat to its own temporal authority. The popes of the 13th century, men like Innocent III and Gregory IX, were not to be trifled with. They viewed Frederick as a dangerous and ambitious opponent, and they used every weapon in their arsenal, from excommunication to stirring up rebellion among the Italian cities, to stop him. Frederick II's court in Sicily was a center of intellectual and cultural life. It was a fusion of the best of the Norman, Greek, and Islamic traditions. He was a scientist, a poet, and a scholar. He was an avid falconer and wrote a famous book on the subject, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, or The Art of Hunting with Birds. He founded the University of Naples, the first state-sponsored university in Europe, to train administrators for his new kingdom. He was a man who was deeply curious about the world, a kind of pre-Renaissance figure who was born a bit too early. He was also a man who was deeply pragmatic and sometimes ruthless. He was perfectly willing to use military force to get what he wanted. In his campaigns against the Lombard League, a confederation of northern Italian cities, were a testament to his military skill. The conflict between Frederick and the papacy was a kind of a grand medieval chess match. Frederick would campaign in the north, besieging cities and trying to force them to submit. The popes would excommunicate him, declaring him a heretic and the Antichrist. This constant conflict was a gift to the Italian city-states. It allowed them to play the emperor and the pope against each other, always siding with the weaker power to gain more autonomy. They were learning the fine art of political neutrality and of profiting from the conflicts of others. The struggle also solidified the two great factions of Italian politics, the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Emperor. These were not always clear-cut divisions. A city could be Guelph one day and Ghibelline the next, depending on its political interests. It was a fluid and often confusing system of alliances and betrayals. Frederick's dream of a unified Italian kingdom under his rule was never fully realized. The opposition of the popes, the resilience of the Italian communes, and the constant pressure of his German affairs were simply too much for one man to handle. When he died in 1250, his dynasty, the Hohenstaufens, began to unravel. His successors were unable to maintain his vast inheritance, and the Kingdom of Sicily was eventually taken over by the French House of Anjou with the Pope's blessing. The death of the Stupor Mundi marked the end of a grand and ambitious imperial project in Italy. The stage was now clear for the cities themselves to become the masters of their own destiny. The long and bloody struggle had, in a way, cleared the way for a new kind of power to emerge, a power that was born not in a castle or a cathedral, but in the bustling, crowded, and incredibly ambitious streets of the Italian cities. Historians still argue about whether Frederick II was a forward-thinking secular ruler who was ahead of his time, or simply a ruthless, calculating king who used modern ideas to justify his power. The death of Frederick II left a power vacuum in Italy, and it was a vacuum that was quickly filled by a new kind of conflict, a kind of political tribalism that would dominate Italian life for the next century. This was the era of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These two names, which sound like something out of a fantasy novel, were the labels for the two great, rival factions that tore through the cities of Italy. The Ghibellines were the supporters of the Holy Roman Emperor, while the Guelphs were the supporters of the Pope. But it was rarely that simple. A city might be Guelph because it wanted to resist imperial authority, or it might be Ghibelline because it was a rival of a neighboring Guelph city. These weren't just political parties. They were a part of a person's identity, a family loyalty, a social affiliation that often led to street fighting, assassinations, and entire families being exiled. The struggle between these two factions was the backdrop for every major event in the Italian cities. In Florence, for example, the conflict was particularly brutal and dramatic. The Guelph and Ghibelline families, often wealthy and powerful, vied for control of the city's government. They would build fortified towers in the city center, and the streets would sometimes become battlefields. A family that was on top one day might find itself exiled the next, their property confiscated, and their political rivals in power. This kind of political instability, while chaotic, also fueled a kind of civic energy. The cities were constantly in flux, and the need to defend one's family and one's faction led to a kind of intense political engagement. It was an era of intense loyalty and even more intense betrayal. The Ghibelline cause lost a lot of its steam after the death of Frederick the Viekans and the subsequent collapse of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, but the factionalism itself continued. The Ghibellines of one city might ally with the Ghibellines of another, while the Guelphs would form their own league. This created a network of alliances and feuds that crisscrossed the peninsula. The conflict was a kind of a low-grade civil war that was always simmering just below the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. It was a time when even a person's name could tell you which side they were on. Dante Alighieri, the famous poet, was a white Guelph, a faction that was later exiled from Florence by the Black Guelphs. This personal and political tragedy would become the subject of his greatest work. Meanwhile, the communes themselves were becoming more sophisticated in their governance. They were moving from a simple form of government where all the citizens had a say to a more complex system. The old aristocratic families, who had once held all the power, were slowly being replaced by a new kind of power broker, the wealthy merchants and bankers. The rise of these new elites was a direct result of the commercial success of the cities. They were the ones who were making the money, and they wanted a say in how the city was run. They created new councils and new offices, often with strange-sounding names like the podestà, an outside official who was hired to run the city for a short period to prevent local factions from seizing complete control. These officials were meant to be neutral, a kind of a hired-in CEO of the city, and their existence was a testament to how deep the political divisions ran. They were often experts in law and administration, and they would travel from city to city, running one after another. This was a period of both immense creativity and immense violence. The political conflicts were brutal, but they also spurred the cities onto greater heights. The competition between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and between the cities themselves, led to a kind of civic pride that was almost unprecedented. They would build magnificent cathedrals, grand public buildings, and beautiful city halls to show off their wealth and their power. The great monuments of Italy, like the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence or the Doge's Palace in Venice, are a testament to this incredible burst of energy. It was a strange mix of the sacred and the profane, of a passionate love for one's city and a ruthless desire to destroy one's political rivals. Historians still argue about whether the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict was a true ideological struggle or simply a convenient label for a series of local and family rivalries. The 12th and 13th centuries were a time of immense political and social innovation in Italy. The cities, with their vibrant economies, were becoming the new centers of power. The idea of the commune, a self-governing city-state, was solidifying. These communes were a kind of an early experiment in republicanism, a radical departure from the feudal norm of the rest of Europe. The citizens of these communes, particularly the wealthy merchants, bankers, and artisans, were forming their own councils and electing their own officials. They were, in essence, taking power away from the traditional aristocratic families and the local bishops. This was a messy process, full of internal conflicts and rivalries, but it was also incredibly dynamic. It was the moment when the people of the cities started to believe that they could govern themselves, that they didn't need a distant emperor or a local noble to tell them what to do. The structure of these communes was often very complex. At first, they were governed by consuls, a group of elected officials who were often chosen from the most prominent families. But as the internal factionalism and the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict grew more intense, they started to hire an outside official, a podestà, as a kind of neutral administrator. This person was almost always a foreigner, a man from another city who was hired to act as the chief magistrate and military commander for a short period, usually a year. His job was to enforce the law and prevent any one faction from seizing complete control. He was a professional political referee, a kind of CEO for hire, and his existence was a testament to how deep the political divisions ran. The communes also developed their own unique legal systems. They were based on Roman law, which had never fully disappeared from Italy, but they were adapted to the needs of a commercial society. The new legal codes were focused on things like contracts, property rights, and commercial disputes. This new kind of law was a perfect fit for a society of merchants and bankers, and it helped to fuel their economic growth. The cities were also becoming centers of learning. They founded their own universities, like the famous one in Bologna, which was a center for the study of law. These universities produced a new class of educated professionals, lawyers, doctors, and notaries who would go on to work for the communes and the great merchant families. This was also the era when the cities started to compete with each other in a different way, with art and architecture. The construction of a grand cathedral or a magnificent city hall became a matter of civic pride, a way of showing off a city's wealth and power. The Duomo in Florence, for example, was a project that lasted for centuries and was a symbol of the city's ambition. The competition for the best artists and architects was fierce, and it helped to fuel the creative energy that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The cities were a kind of cultural incubator, a place where new ideas could flourish and where talent could be rewarded. The city of Venice, remember, was a kind of a different animal. It was a republic, but it was governed by a tight-knit oligarchy of merchant families. They had a complex system of councils, and their chief executive, the Doge, was a figurehead who was elected for life. Venice was an incredibly stable state, in part because its system of government was designed to prevent any one family from becoming too powerful. It was also a state that was focused entirely on its maritime empire. Its power was not based on land, but on its control of the seas and its trade routes to the east. It was a completely different kind of political experiment from the messy and often chaotic communes of the mainland. But both the communes and the Venetian Republic were part of the same great historical trend, the rise of a new kind of urban power that would eventually eclipse the power of the feudal lords and the distant emperors. Historians still argue about whether the communes were a genuine expression of democratic ideals, or if they were simply a new form of oligarchy where power shifted from the old landowning families to the new wealthy merchant families. The truth, as is often the case, is a mixture of both. The political and social turmoil of the Italian cities in the 13th century was a kind of a grand stage for a truly remarkable mind, a person who would be a poet, a political theorist, and a bit of a cranky old man. This was Dante Alighieri, and his life story is almost a perfect example of the complexities of Florentine politics. Dante was born in Florence in 1265 into a family that was part of the Guelph faction. He was a man of immense learning and talent, and he was deeply involved in the political life of his city. At this time, the Guelph faction in Florence had split into two rival groups, the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. The White Guelphs, to which Dante belonged, were more moderate and were wary of the Pope's increasing temporal power. The Black Guelphs, on the other hand, were staunchly pro-papal and were more willing to use their political connections with the Pope to gain an advantage. The conflict between these two factions was a constant source of tension in Florence. It was a kind of a civil war fought with words, backroom deals, and occasional street fighting. Dante himself was a member of the city's governing council, the priors, and he was involved in the political decisions that would eventually lead to his downfall. In 1301, while Dante was on a diplomatic mission to Rome, the Black Guelphs, with the help of the Pope and the French prince, seized control of Florence. They declared the White Guelphs to be traitors and exiled them from the city. The sentence for Dante was particularly harsh. He was to be burned at the stake if he ever returned. It was a kind of political death sentence, and it meant that Dante would spend the rest of his life in exile, wandering from city to city, a bitter and a bit resentful man. His exile was a traumatic experience, and it would become the central theme of his most famous work, The Divine Comedy. The poem, which is a kind of a spiritual and political journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, is filled with real-life characters from the politics of his day. He puts his political enemies in hell, and he even has a few kind words for some of his political rivals. The poem is not just a work of literature. It is a profound and moving commentary on the political and moral failings of his time. It is also, in a way, a historical document, a window into the messy and often brutal world of Italian city-state politics. Dante, remember, was a kind of a walking symbol of what could happen to a person who got too involved in the political life of a city. One day you could be a respected member of the governing council. The next, you could be a landless exile with a death sentence on your head. His personal story, however, is a part of a larger, more important trend. The political instability and the constant factionalism of the Italian city-states were a kind of a necessary growing pain. The cities were becoming more politically aware, and the citizens were becoming more engaged in their own governance, even if that engagement often led to violence and exile. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines were a kind of a training ground for a new kind of political consciousness. They were learning the hard lessons of power and its limitations. The cities were also becoming incredibly wealthy, and this wealth was fueling a new kind of social mobility. A person's family name still mattered, but so did their wealth and their political skill. The old feudal order, where a person's destiny was determined at birth, was slowly but surely being replaced by a more fluid and a more dynamic one. The Florentine, Genoese, and Venetian merchants who traveled across the world were bringing back not just silks and spices, but also a new kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of a worldly wisdom that was a stark contrast to the insular world of the feudal manor. Historians still argue about the true nature of Dante's politics. Was he a true Republican who wanted to see a free and independent Florence, or was he a disappointed Guelph who simply wanted to be on the winning side? The answer is probably a mix of both. His poetry, however, is a timeless testament to the power of a single person's story to illuminate the grand historical themes of an era. The fragile political ecosystem of the Italian city-states, with its Guelphs and Ghibellines, its rival families, and its hired-in officials, was about to face a challenge of a completely different magnitude. It was not a political or military challenge, but a biological one, a silent, invisible foe that would arrive on the winds of change and leave a trail of devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the mid-14th century, a great plague, the Black Death, swept across Asia and Europe, and it arrived in Italy in 1347, carried by Genoese trading ships returning from the east. The plague, a terrible disease that caused a person to swell with black boils and die within a few days, spread with terrifying speed. It was a kind of a final, gruesome chapter to an era of conflict and chaos, a kind of a reset button that no one could have ever seen coming. The Italian cities, with their crowded populations and their extensive trade networks, were particularly vulnerable. The disease spread like wildfire, moving from port to port, and then inland along the trade routes. The sheer speed of the disease was terrifying. One day a person would be healthy, the next they would be sick, and the day after that they would be dead. No one knew what caused it, and they were powerless to stop it. People thought it was a punishment from God, or a miasma, a kind of bad air, or even a deliberate act of poisoning. The fear and the paranoia were immense. People would abandon their sick relatives, and doctors would refuse to treat the dying. The social fabric of the cities, which had been so tightly woven, began to unravel. The death toll was catastrophic. In some cities, half the population, or even more, was wiped out. It is one of those numbers that is almost impossible to comprehend. Think of all the people, the farmers, the merchants, the artisans, the priests, the bankers, all gone in the span of a few months. The economic consequences were equally devastating. The urban economies, which were based on trade and labor, were completely upended. The fields went unplowed, and the workshops went silent. But in the long run, the Black Death had a surprising and, in a way, beneficial effect. For the first time in centuries, there was a surplus of land and a shortage of labor. This meant that the working people who survived were in a much stronger bargaining position. Their wages rose, and their standard of living improved. The old feudal system, which had been in decline for centuries, was dealt a final fatal blow. It was a kind of a gruesome and terrible liberation. The Black Death also had a profound impact on the culture and psychology of the people. The old certainties, the belief in a rational and orderly world, were shattered. Art and literature, for a while, became obsessed with death and the fleeting nature of life. The famous allegorical painting, The Triumph of Death, is a perfect example of this. But the plague also led to a kind of a renewed sense of life, a desire to live in the moment and to enjoy the good things that life had to offer. It was a kind of a wake-up call, a realization that life was short and that you had to make the most of it. This psychological shift, this new kind of carpe diem mentality, would be one of the factors that would fuel the coming of the Renaissance. It was a kind of a bitter irony. The terrible death of so many people led to a kind of a rebirth for those who survived. The papacy, remember, was also going through its own period of crisis at this time. The popes had moved their court from Rome to Avignon in France, a period known as the Avignon Papacy, which had lasted for almost 70 years. This created a profound sense of spiritual and political instability in Italy. The city of Rome, which was the ancient seat of the papacy, was in a state of decay and chaos. It was no longer the great spiritual and political center of the Christian world. It was a city in decline, a kind of a ghost of its former self. This crisis in the church would only add to the sense of uncertainty and change that was sweeping across Italy. Historians still argue about the true number of deaths caused by the Black Death in Italy and whether the long-term economic and social effects were truly beneficial. The Black Death, with its brutal efficiency, had done what no army or emperor could. It had completely shaken the foundations of Italian society. The old political and social structures, already weakened, were now on their last legs. The shortage of labor, the rise in wages, and the newfound economic power of the urban middle class led to a kind of social and political restructuring. The old style of warfare, which relied on citizen militias, became less and less tenable. The cities were getting richer, and the people who lived in them were less inclined to risk their lives for the political squabbles of their rulers. Why risk your neck for a battle when you could just pay someone else to do it for you? And this is where a new kind of a warrior, a kind of a professional fighter, a mercenary, entered the stage. These mercenaries were known as condottieri, and they would dominate the military landscape of Italy for the next century. The word condottieri comes from the Italian word condotta, which means contract. And that's exactly what these men were, professional soldiers who fought for whoever would pay them the most. They were organized into large companies, often led by a charismatic captain, and they would offer their services to the highest bidder. A city that wanted to go to war with a rival could simply hire a company of condottieri to do the fighting for them. This was a much more efficient and, in a way, less risky way of doing things. You didn't have to raise an army of your own citizens, and you didn't have to worry about the political consequences of a defeat. The condottieri were a kind of a neutral force, a kind of a modern-day security company. They fought for money, not for love of a city or a cause. This was a radical break from the old ways of war, where a person's allegiance was to their lord or their city. The most famous of the condottieri were men like Francesco Sforza and John Hawkwood, an English mercenary who became one of the most powerful men in Italy. These men were not just soldiers, they were also cunning politicians and shrewd businessmen. They would often switch sides in the middle of a conflict, or they would threaten a city with a siege until the city paid them to leave. The condottieri were a product of their time, a testament to the fact that money was becoming a more powerful force than loyalty or tradition. They were a kind of a wild card in the complex game of Italian politics. A city could be losing a war, and then a new company of condottieri would show up, and the entire balance of power would shift. This made warfare a kind of a gentleman's game, a game of maneuver and bluff, where the goal was not to destroy your enemy, but to force them into a negotiation. The wars of the condottieri were often more like a kind of a slow-motion chess match than a grand, bloody battle. The rise of the condottieri also had a profound impact on the political structure of the Italian cities. The old republican governments, with their complex councils and their hired-in officials, were often not very good at making quick military decisions. The condottieri needed a single person to negotiate with, a single person who could pay them and give them orders. This led to the rise of the signori, or lords, a kind of a strong man who would take control of a city, often with the support of the condottieri. The signori were a kind of a new kind of ruler, a man who ruled not by inherited right, but by force of personality and military power. They were often members of the old families who had been vying for power for centuries, and they were finally able to put an end to the political chaos and the endless factionalism. The signori, once in power, would often transform their cities. They would build magnificent palaces, commission great works of art, and establish their own courts. They brought a new kind of political stability to a society that had been torn apart by conflict for centuries. But they also put an end to the republican ideals that had fueled the communes for so long. The cities, which had once been a kind of a messy experiment in self-governance, were now becoming hereditary principalities, ruled by a single, all-powerful lord. It was a kind of a trade-off, stability for freedom, and for many people, after so many years of chaos and war, it was a trade they were more than willing to make. Historians still argue whether the condottieri were a corrupting influence on Italian warfare, or if they were, in fact, a kind of a necessary and rational response to the political and social changes of the era. The political chaos and the rise of the signori laid the groundwork for a new kind of social and intellectual movement, a kind of cultural and artistic rebirth that would be one of the most remarkable periods in all of human history. This was the beginning of the Renaissance, a word that simply means rebirth in French. And it was a rebirth of a culture that had been lost for centuries, the culture of ancient Greece and Rome. The Italian scholars and artists of the 14th century began to look back to the classical world, to its literature, its art, and its philosophy as a source of inspiration. They saw the classical world not just as a historical period, but as a kind of golden age, a time of intellectual and artistic perfection that they wanted to recapture. The Renaissance did not happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process that began in the Italian cities and then spread throughout the rest of Europe. At the heart of the Renaissance was a new intellectual movement called humanism. Humanists were scholars and thinkers who were obsessed with the study of the classical world. They would pore over ancient manuscripts, translate Greek and Latin texts, and try to understand the world as the ancient Romans and Greeks had. But they were not just interested in the past. They were also interested in the present. Humanists believed that a person should be well-rounded, that they should study not just theology, but also rhetoric, history, poetry, and philosophy. They believed that a person should be an active and engaged citizen, not a passive observer. This was a radical break from the medieval tradition, which was dominated by the study of theology and the idea that a person's worth was determined by their place in a feudal hierarchy. Humanism was, in a way, a kind of a celebration of the human potential, the idea that a person could achieve great things with their own talent and their own intellect. The cities of Italy, with their wealth and their dynamic urban societies, were the perfect place for this new movement to flourish. The wealthy merchants and bankers, who had risen to power through their own efforts, were a natural audience for the humanist message. They were less interested in the old feudal ideas of honor and tradition, and more interested in the new ideas of a person's individual worth and a person's ability to shape their own destiny. They became the great patrons of the arts, commissioning magnificent paintings, sculptures, and buildings. They were not just buying a work of art, they were also making a statement about their own wealth, their own status, and their own cultural sophistication. The patronage of these wealthy families was the engine that would drive the Renaissance. Florence, in particular, was the heart of this new movement. It was a city of incredible wealth, a city of bankers and merchants who had made their fortunes in trade and finance. It was a place where a family could rise from obscurity to immense power in a single generation. And it was a city that was a kind of a cultural melting pot, a place where artists, scholars, and thinkers from all over Italy would come to work and to study. It was home to some of the greatest artists of all time, men like Brunelleschi, who designed the magnificent dome of the Florence Cathedral, and Donatello, who sculpted the beautiful bronze statue of David. These men were not just artisans, they were also intellectual figures who were deeply engaged with the ideas of their time. The Renaissance was, in a way, the perfect marriage of money and talent, of a new kind of urban wealth and a new kind of cultural energy. The papacy, remember, was still a major player in this. The popes, who had returned to Rome from Avignon, were also becoming great patrons of the arts. They wanted to restore Rome to its former glory, and they were willing to spend enormous sums of money to do it. The great works of art that we see in the Vatican today like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, were all commissioned by the popes of the Renaissance. It was a kind of a competition, a kind of a cultural arms race between the great families and the great rulers of Italy. This competition, while sometimes a bit wasteful and a bit ostentatious, was also one of the main factors that fueled the incredible creative energy of the era. The Renaissance was, in a way, the natural consequence of all the chaos and the change that had come before it. It was a kind of a glorious flowering of culture that was born out of a period of immense political and social turmoil. Of all the new merchant and banking families that rose to power during the Renaissance, none was more famous or more powerful than the Medici family of Florence. Their story is almost a perfect microcosm of the era, a tale of immense wealth, political cunning, and a profound love of art. The Medici were not a traditional aristocratic family. They were, in fact, an urban family of bankers and merchants who, through a combination of hard work, good luck, and a bit of political ruthlessness, came to dominate the financial life of Florence and eventually a great deal of Europe. They were the kind of people who in a feudal society would have been considered commoners. But in the new, dynamic, urban world of Renaissance Italy, their wealth was more powerful than a nobleman's title. The family's rise began with Giovanni di Bici de' Medici, a shrewd banker who founded the Medici Bank. He was a master of finance, and his bank, with its branches all over Europe, became the most important in the world. He was a quiet man who preferred to work behind the scenes, and he used his wealth to build up a network of political alliances and to win the loyalty of the Florentine people. His son, Cosimo de' Medici, was even more ambitious. He was a man of immense charm and intelligence, and he was able to consolidate the family's power in Florence. He did so not by force, but by a kind of a gentle and very clever form of manipulation. He would lend money to the great families of Florence, and then, when they were in his debt, he would use his influence to get his friends and supporters elected to the city's governing councils. He ruled Florence for 30 years, but he never held a single official title. He was simply known as the father of his country, a kind of a de facto ruler who was more powerful than any duke or prince. Cosimo was a man who understood the power of patronage. He was not just a banker. He was also a great patron of the arts and letters. He commissioned magnificent buildings like the Palazzo Medici, and he supported some of the greatest artists of his time, including Donatello and Fra Angelico. He was a man who saw art not just as a beautiful thing, but as a way of demonstrating his wealth and his power. His patronage was a kind of a brilliant public relations strategy. It made the Medici family seem generous and cultured, and it helped to cement their reputation as the unofficial rulers of Florence. Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the culmination of this process. He was a man of extraordinary talent, a poet, a diplomat, and a political genius. He ruled Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492, and his reign is often considered the high point of the Florentine Renaissance. He was a brilliant diplomat, and he was able to maintain a kind of a fragile peace in Italy through a series of complex alliances and treaties. He was a man who was obsessed with art and beauty, and he surrounded himself with the most brilliant minds of his time. Artists like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo all spent time in his court. Lorenzo was, in a way, the quintessential Renaissance man, a person who was brilliant in a dozen different fields and who embodied the new humanist ideal of a person's unlimited potential. The Medici were not always popular. They had their enemies, and they were often criticized for their ambition and their political ruthlessness. There was, in fact, a conspiracy to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano in 1478, a famous event known as the Pazzi Conspiracy, which was a testament to the kind of bitter rivalries that ran through Florentine politics. But the Medici, with their immense wealth and their political cunning, were able to survive and to thrive. They were a new kind of power, a power that was based not on tradition or inherited titles, but on money, influence, and a deep appreciation for culture. They were, in a way, the face of the Italian Renaissance. Their story is a perfect example of how a person's ambition and a person's money could completely reshape the political and cultural landscape of a city. While Florence was captivated by the rise of the Medici and the flourishing of art, a different kind of power was reaching its zenith in the northern lagoon. This was the Republic of Venice, and its story is one of a unique blend of political stability, immense commercial power, and an almost obsessive focus on trade. Unlike the chaotic, faction-ridden communes of the mainland, Venice had developed a remarkably stable form of government. It was, in theory, a republic, but in practice, it was a tight-knit oligarchy ruled by a few hundred noble families who had made their fortunes in trade. Their chief executive, the Doge, was elected for life, but his power was carefully circumscribed by a series of councils and committees. This system was designed to prevent any one person or any one family from becoming a tyrant. It was a clever built-in system of checks and balances that allowed Venice to avoid the kind of political instability that plagued its rivals. Venice's power was not based on land, but on its control of the sea. The city was a giant floating warehouse, a commercial hub that connected the markets of Europe with the markets of the East. Venetian merchants, with their great trading galleys, controlled the flow of luxury goods like silk, spices, and glass. They were the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, and their navy was the most powerful in the world. Venice's power was not just commercial, it was also territorial. The city-state had its own mainland territories, known as the terra firma, which it had acquired to secure its food supply and to protect its trade routes. But its real power was in its overseas empire, a string of colonies and trading posts that stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. This empire, which included places like Crete and Cyprus, was a testament to Venice's ambition and its incredible commercial reach. The Venetian government, for all its stability, was a deeply secretive one. The city was ruled by a silent consensus among the great merchant families, and they were always a little bit paranoid about spies and traitors. They had their own secret police, their own network of spies, and their own form of justice. The most powerful of their councils was the Council of Ten, a secret committee that had the power to investigate and punish anyone who was a threat to the state. It was a cold, efficient, and a little bit frightening form of government. but it worked. It gave Venice the kind of political stability that allowed it to outlast almost every other Italian city-state. The Venetians were not interested in grand, philosophical debates about the nature of man. They were interested in making money, and they were very, very good at it. The city itself was a wonder to behold. It was a kind of a fantasy world of canals and palaces, of gondolas and grand bridges. The architecture, with its Venetian Gothic style, was a unique blend of Eastern and Western influences, a testament to the city's cosmopolitan nature. The great churches and palaces were a kind of a celebration of the city's wealth and its piety. Venice was a city that was obsessed with its own image, a city that saw itself as a kind of a new Rome, a city of immense power and eternal stability. It even had its own unique, a little bit strange holiday, the Marriage of the Sea, where the Doge would sail out into the Adriatic on his magnificent barge and drop a ring into the water as a symbol of the city's eternal dominion over the sea. It was a kind of a theatrical public relations stunt, a way of reminding everyone, including themselves, that Venice was the queen of the sea. Historians still argue about whether Venice was a true republic or a kind of a hereditary oligarchy in disguise. The truth is probably that it was a bit of both, a kind of a political experiment that was born out of a unique set of geographical and historical circumstances. It was a city that was a testament to the idea that a group of people with a little bit of luck and a lot of focus could build a commercial and political empire that would last for centuries. It was a city that in its own way was just as remarkable as the Florence of the Medici, and perhaps even more stable. As the Italian city-states thrived and the great banking families rose to power, the church itself was in the midst of a profound crisis. The return of the papacy from Avignon in 1377 was meant to restore order, but it only created a new and even more dramatic problem. This was the Western Schism, a period from 1378 to 1417, when the Catholic Church had two, and for a short time, even three popes, all claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. One pope ruled from Rome, and another, who was supported by France, ruled from Avignon. The world was utterly confused. Who was the real pope? Which one's sacraments were valid? Which one's cardinals were legitimate? It was a kind of a spiritual civil war that deeply divided Europe and made a lot of people question the authority of the church itself. The scandal and the confusion of the schism did immense damage to the papacy's moral authority. This political chaos within the church, however, was a kind of a gift to the Italian city-states and their powerful rulers. It gave them a chance to play one pope against another and to increase their own power and their own influence. The Council of Constance in 1417 finally ended the schism, and it elected a single pope, Martin V, who brought the papacy back to Rome. But the damage had been done. The popes who followed had to work very hard to restore the church's prestige and its power. They did this in two ways. First, by consolidating their temporal rule over the papal states, and second, by becoming great patrons of the arts. They understood that if they were to regain their spiritual authority, they had to rebuild Rome and make it the most beautiful and magnificent city in the world. This led to the era of the Renaissance popes, men who were more like powerful princes than spiritual leaders. They were often members of the great Italian families, and they used the papacy to advance their own family's interests. They were often worldly men who had mistresses and illegitimate children, and they were more interested in art and politics than in theology. Pope Sixtus IV, for example, was the patron of the Sistine Chapel, but he was also a ruthless politician who was involved in the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici family. Pope Alexander VI, who was a member of the notorious Borgia family, was an even more extreme example. He used the papacy to build up his family's power and to secure a dukedom for his son, Cesare Borgia. These popes were not just the heads of the church, they were also the most powerful political figures in Italy. The Renaissance popes were, in a way, a product of their time. They were part of the same great historical trend that was happening in the rest of Italy, the move from republicanism to princely rule. They were not elected to be spiritual leaders. They were elected to be powerful rulers who could protect the church's interests and who could advance the interests of their own families. They were part of a world where money and power were becoming more important than piety and tradition. Their courts in Rome were magnificent, filled with artists, poets, and scholars. They commissioned some of the greatest works of art in human history, including the work of Michelangelo and Raphael. They were, in a way, the final flowering of the Renaissance. But their worldliness and their corruption would in the end have a terrible price. The Protestant Reformation, which would begin a few decades later, was in part a reaction to the excesses and the corruption of the Renaissance papacy. Men like Martin Luther would look at the worldly popes in Rome, and they would see a church that had completely lost its way. The papacy, which had spent so much money and so much effort to rebuild Rome and to restore its prestige, was about to face a challenge of a completely different kind, a spiritual challenge that would tear the Christian world apart. The Renaissance popes were the kind of rulers who were perfectly suited for the world of Italian politics, but they were not at all prepared for the storm that was coming from the north. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance popes were a corrupting influence on the church, or if they were a necessary part of the process of rebuilding and restoring the church's temporal power in Italy. The political and intellectual world of Renaissance Italy was in many ways a world of great paradoxes. It was a time of immense artistic creativity and immense political cynicism, and no one embodied this paradox more than Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat and political theorist who lived in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. He was a man who saw the world as it was, not as it should be, and he was the first person to write a political treatise that was based on that premise. His most famous work, The Prince, is a kind of a handbook for a ruler, a guide to how to acquire and maintain power in a chaotic and often brutal world. The book's famous premise is that a ruler must be both a lion and a fox, a lion to terrify his enemies, and a fox to recognize their traps. Machiavelli's political philosophy was a radical departure from the medieval tradition. For centuries, political thinkers had argued that a ruler should be a just and a moral person, a kind of a spiritual leader who was guided by Christian ethics. Machiavelli completely rejected this idea. He argued that a ruler, in order to be successful, had to be pragmatic and, if necessary, ruthless. A ruler, he argued, should not be bound by moral or ethical constraints if those constraints would lead to his downfall. He famously wrote that it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved, if he cannot be both. His ideas were shocking to his contemporaries, and they have been a source of endless debate ever since. Was Machiavelli a cynical and amoral political theorist, or was he a kind of a proto-modern realist who simply had the courage to describe the world as it was? Machiavelli's political ideas were shaped by his own personal experience. He lived in Florence during a period of intense political change. He saw the fall of the Medici family, the rise of a republican government, and the subsequent return of the Medici with the help of foreign armies. He was an eyewitness to the kind of political instability and betrayal that was a constant part of Italian life. He himself was a kind of a tragic figure. He worked for the Florentine Republic, and he was a tireless and devoted public servant. But when the Medici returned to power, he was tortured and exiled from the city. He spent the rest of his life in a kind of a bitter and frustrated exile, writing his political treatises and trying to get back into the good graces of the powerful. His ideas, for all their controversy, were a kind of a perfect intellectual expression of the world that was emerging in Renaissance Italy. It was a world where money and power were more important than tradition and piety, a world where the old feudal order was being replaced by a new kind of political pragmatism. The Italian princes and the popes of the Renaissance were living by Machiavelli's rules long before he ever wrote them down. They were men who were willing to use any means necessary to secure their power and to advance their own interests. The world of Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander II, was a world that was perfectly suited for Machiavelli's ideas. Borgia was a brilliant and ruthless military commander who carved out his own dukedom in central Italy with a kind of a cold, calculating efficiency that Machiavelli deeply admired. He was, in Machiavelli's eyes, the perfect example of a prince who knew how to acquire and to hold on to power. The Italian political landscape, which had been so unstable for so long, was about to face a new and even more terrifying challenge. This challenge would not come from an internal conflict or a family feud, but from the great unified monarchies of Europe, the new nation-states of France and Spain. These were not the fragmented feudal kingdoms of the past. They were powerful, centralized states with large professional armies. They saw Italy, with its immense wealth and its political fragmentation, as a kind of a prize to be fought over. The era of the Italian city-states' independence, which had lasted for centuries, was about to come to a sudden and very brutal end. The political games that Machiavelli had so brilliantly described were about to be played on a much larger and a much more dangerous stage. The political landscape of Italy in the early 16th century was a kind of a grand stage for the final act of a number of famous and infamous families. The French invasion had created a kind of a free-for-all, and the old dynasties, who had relied on their wealth and their political cunning, were finding that these things were no match for the raw military power of a unified nation-state. Among the most dramatic and most famous of these downfalls was that of the Borgia family. This was a family that was a kind of a walking symbol of the worst excesses of the Renaissance. The head of the family, Rodrigo Borgia, had become Pope Alexander VI, and he had used the papacy to advance the interests of his family with a kind of a ruthless and a bit shameless ambition. His son, Cesare Borgia, was a brilliant and a kind of a terrifying military commander who, with the help of his father's money and his father's influence, was carving out his own dukedom in central Italy. He was, in a way, the kind of a prince that Machiavelli had admired. He was pragmatic, ruthless, and he was able to maintain power with a kind of a cold, calculating efficiency. But the Borgia family's power was completely dependent on the power of their patron, the Pope. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, the family's power evaporated almost overnight. The new Pope, Julius II, who was a bitter enemy of the Borgia family, turned on them. Cesare Borgia, who was once the most feared man in Italy, was arrested and his lands were taken away. He died a few years later in obscurity, a kind of a warning to anyone who thought that a family's power was enough to survive in a world of great kingdoms and great armies. The Borgia's fall was a kind of a perfect example of the new political reality. In the past, a powerful family could rise and fall with the fortunes of their city, but now they were simply pawns in a much larger game, a game that was being played by the great powers of Europe. The Sforza family of Milan, remember, had already lost their duchy to the French. They would, for a time, be able to get it back, but only with the help of the Holy Roman Emperor. But this was a kind of a last gasp, a kind of a final, desperate attempt to hold on to their power. They were no longer the masters of their own destiny. They were a kind of a client state, a puppet of a much larger and a much more powerful ruler. This was a pattern that would be repeated all over Italy. The old families, the old city-states, were simply too weak and too divided to resist the military might of the new nation-states. The Italian wars were a long, drawn-out, and often brutal conflict, a kind of a permanent state of war that tore through the peninsula. The French and the Spanish and the Holy Roman Emperor would fight over the control of Italy, and the Italian people would be caught in the middle. The famous condottieri, who had once dominated the military landscape, were now a kind of a quaint anachronism. The new armies were large, professional, and they were willing to use a kind of a brutal efficiency that the old mercenary captains could only dream of. The old ways of warfare, with their emphasis on maneuver and bluff, were replaced by a new kind of a bloody and destructive conflict. The popes, who had once been the most powerful political figures in Italy, were now finding that their power was also a kind of a fragile thing. They were being pulled in different directions by the great powers of Europe. They would ally with France one day and with Spain the next, and they would always be looking over their shoulders, wondering which of the great powers was going to turn on them next. The age of the Renaissance popes, with their immense power and their immense wealth, was coming to an end. The world of Machiavelli, with its cynical and its pragmatic rulers, was also coming to an end. A new kind of a world was being born, a world of great nation-states, and of a kind of a permanent international conflict. The old, fragmented world of the Italian city-states was for all intents and purposes over. The ongoing wars in Italy between the great powers of Europe would reach a terrible an unforgettable climax in the year 1527. The central character in this dramatic scene was not a king or a pope, but a Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V, a man who, at a young age, controlled an immense empire that included Spain, the Netherlands, and a great deal of Germany and Italy. Charles V was an ambitious and a kind of a quiet and very determined man, and he was a kind of a walking symbol of the new political order. He had been in a long and bitter war with the French king, and he was also in a kind of a cold war with the papacy. The Pope at the time, Clement VII, a member of the Medici family, had made a series of political miscalculations. He had allied himself with France against the Holy Roman Emperor, and he had underestimated the kind of anger and frustration that was building up in the emperor's army. The emperor's army was a kind of a motley collection of soldiers from all over Europe, a kind of a multinational force that was led by a man named the Duke of Bourbon. The army had not been paid in a long time, and the soldiers were restless and hungry. They marched south, and they were, in a way, a kind of a force of nature. They were not a disciplined army. They were a kind of a mob, and they were looking for a city to plunder. The Pope, for his part, was completely unprepared. He had dismissed his own army, and he had convinced himself that the emperor would not dare to attack Rome, the spiritual heart of the Christian world. He was, to put it mildly, mistaken. On the 6th of May, 1527, the army of Charles V, a force of over 30,000 men, stormed the walls of Rome. The city was almost completely defenseless, and the soldiers, who were a mix of German Protestants and Spanish Catholics, descended on the city with a kind of a terrifying fury. The sack of Rome that followed was one of the most brutal and most destructive events in the history of the city. The soldiers, who had not been paid in months, ransacked the city, pillaged its churches, and murdered its citizens with a kind of a horrifying and a little bit detached violence. The Pope, Clement VII, was forced to flee to his castle, the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was a kind of a prisoner in his own city. The sack was a kind of a profound psychological shock to the Italian people. Rome had not been sacked in almost 1,000 years, and it was a city that was seen as a kind of a sacred and eternal city. The sack of Rome was a kind of a violent and a very public declaration that the old world was over. The great powers of Europe were not going to respect the old rules, and they were not going to respect the Pope. The event was, in a way, a kind of a final, gruesome chapter to the Italian Renaissance. The city of Rome, which had been the great artistic and cultural center of the world, was now a city in ruins. The sack also forced a kind of a political reckoning. The Pope, who had once been the most powerful political figure in Italy, was now a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was forced to come to terms with the new political reality. He had no choice but to accept the dominance of Spain in Italy, and he had to make a kind of a deal with the devil. The sack of Rome was a turning point. It marked the end of the Italian wars and the beginning of a new era. The papacy, which had been so ambitious and so worldly during the Renaissance, was now a weakened and a kind of a chastened institution. The Italian city-states, with their old rivalries and their old alliances, were now a kind of a pathetic and a kind of a little bit embarrassing anachronism. The great powers of Europe had finally had their way. The old, fragmented world of the Italian city-states was completely and utterly destroyed. The sack was a kind of a final, bloody exclamation point at the end of a very long and a very complicated sentence. It was a kind of a brutal reminder that the rules of the game had changed, and that the Italian people were now a kind of a pawn in a much larger and a much more dangerous game. The brutal sack of Rome marked the end of an era. The Italian wars, which had been a kind of a messy, prolonged conflict, were finally winding down, and the great powers of Europe were ready to formalize their control over the peninsula. The old, fragmented world of the city-states, with their republican ideals and their internal conflicts, was giving way to a new political reality: the consolidation of power under hereditary rulers, and in many cases, under foreign control. The republics, which had been a kind of a unique and vibrant political experiment for centuries, were now a thing of the past. The signori, or the powerful lords who had taken control of the cities, were now transforming their rule from a kind of a temporary strongman power into a permanent hereditary right. This was a kind of a final and irreversible move towards the kind of princely rule that was the norm in the rest of Europe. Florence, the birthplace of the Renaissance, was a perfect example of this. The Medici family, who had been exiled and then returned with the help of foreign armies, now ruled the city with a kind of a renewed and much more formal power. The old republican institutions, the councils, and the committees were all abolished, and the city was now ruled by a single hereditary duke. The first of these dukes was Alessandro de' Medici, a rather ruthless and unloved ruler who was in a way a kind of a symbol of the end of the Florentine Republic. He was a man who ruled not by popular consent, but by force, and he was a kind of a final, gruesome chapter to the city's long and complicated story of self-governance. But the Medici, to their credit, were also a kind of a forward-thinking family. They understood that if they were to survive, they had to embrace the new political reality. They had to be more like the great princes of Europe, and less like the old merchant rulers of the past. The new rulers of Italy, whether they were the Medici in Florence or the Sforza in Milan, were not just political figures. They were also patrons of the arts and letters. They understood that a magnificent court, with its artists, its poets, and its scholars, was a way of demonstrating their power and their prestige. They were, in a way, creating a new kind of a political legitimacy, a legitimacy that was based not on an old feudal title, but on a person's wealth and their cultural sophistication. This led to a kind of a final, magnificent flowering of the Renaissance, a kind of a last gasp of creativity before the political and the military realities of the new era took over. The courts of the new Italian princes, from Milan to Naples, were filled with artists, with musicians, and with scholars. The political fragmentation of Italy, which had been a kind of a unique and a little bit charming feature for centuries, was now a thing of the past. The peninsulas was now a kind of a new political map, a map that was dominated by a few large hereditary principalities. The old rivalry between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which had been a source of so much chaos and so much energy, was now a kind of a quaint anachronism. The rulers, whether they were the popes or the princes, were now more interested in their own survival and in their own power than in the old ideological conflicts of the past. The papal states, with their worldly popes, were now a kind of a political entity that was just like any other. The popes, with their immense wealth and their political cunning, were able to consolidate their rule over central Italy. They were no longer just spiritual leaders. They were now the most powerful political figures in Italy. This was a kind of a final and a kind of a irreversible transformation. The world of the Italian city-states was over, and a new world, a world of powerful, hereditary principalities, had taken its place. Historians still argue about whether the transition from republics to principalities was a kind of inevitable and a necessary step towards a more stable society, or if it was a kind of a tragic and a kind of a shameful end to the republican ideals that had flourished for so long in Italy. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a mix of both. The cities, with their endless internal conflicts and their constant wars, were, in a way, crying out for a kind of a more stable and a more efficient form of government. The princes, with their wealth and their military power, were able to give it to them. The political shifts in Italy were a kind of a final, dramatic play, and in the midst of it, one family, the Medici of Florence, was not only surviving but thriving. They had gone from being the unofficial rulers of a republic to the official rulers of a new kind of state. In 1532, the city of Florence, which had been a kind of a messy and often chaotic experiment in self-governance, was officially transformed into a hereditary principality. The first duke was Alessandro de' Medici, a rather ruthless and unloved ruler, but his successor, Cosimo Vibertus de' Medici, was a man of a completely different caliber. He was a brilliant and a very determined ruler, a man who would, in a way, finish the process of transforming Florence from a city-state into a proper modern kingdom. Cosimo the Viber was a man who understood that if he was to survive, he had to be more than just a powerful lord. He had to be a true sovereign. He centralized power in his own hands. He created a new professional army, and he completely reorganized the state's finances. He was a man who understood the importance of an empire, and he launched a series of military campaigns to expand his territory. He conquered the city of Siena, which had been a kind of a long-standing rival of Florence, and he incorporated it into his new state. He was a man who was building a nation, and he was doing it with a kind of a cold, calculating efficiency. He was a kind of a perfect example of a Machiavellian prince, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to secure his power and to create a lasting state. In 1569, Pope Pius IV, with the blessing of the Holy Roman Emperor, crowned Cosimo as the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. This was a monumental event. It was a kind of a final, official recognition that the old world was over and that a new world had begun. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was not just a powerful state. It was also a kind of a cultural and artistic center of Europe. The Medici, with their immense wealth and their deep appreciation for art, continued to be great patrons. Cosimo the Viber himself was a kind of a builder, and he commissioned magnificent palaces and public works, like the Uffizi, which was originally an administrative office, but would later become one of the most famous art museums in the world. He was a man who understood that a great ruler had to be a patron of the arts, and that art was a way of demonstrating a person's power and a person's status. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was a kind of a model for the new Italian states. It was a stable, centralized state that was ruled by a single hereditary family. It was a kind of a quiet and a very successful example of the kind of political transformation that was happening all over Italy. The old republican ideals, which had been so dear to the Florentines, were now a thing of the past. The people of Florence, who had once been so fiercely independent, were now subjects of a powerful hereditary ruler. It was a kind of a trade-off. They had given up their political freedom, but they had gained a kind of a new and a kind of a very welcome stability. The wars were over, the factions were gone, and the people of Tuscany were finally able to live in peace. Meanwhile, the other parts of Italy were also undergoing a similar transformation. The fragmented south, which had been a kind of a chaotic collection of different rulers for centuries, was now under the firm control of a single, powerful ruler, the King of Spain. The Papal States, which had been a kind of a political battleground for centuries, were now a kind of a well-organized and a well-run state. The political map of Italy, which had been a kind of a mosaic of 1,000 different pieces, was now a kind of a much simpler and a much more recognizable map. The old world was gone, and a new one, a world of powerful hereditary principalities and foreign rulers, had taken its place. It was a world that was in a way less exciting and less chaotic, but it was also a world that was in a way much more stable, with the old republics mostly gone and the independent city-states now ruled by hereditary princes or foreign powers. A new political order had settled over Italy. But this new order was not an independent one. The peninsula had become a kind of a political battleground for the great European powers, and in the end, one of them emerged as the clear victor. This was Spain, and the second half of the 16th century marked a long period of Spanish hegemony over Italy. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was also the King of Spain, had, with the help of his ruthless armies, finally put an end to the Italian wars. He had defeated the French, and he had humbled the Pope, and in doing so, he had secured a kind of a political dominance over the peninsula that would last for almost 200 years. The Spanish controlled vast and incredibly wealthy territories in Italy. They ruled the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily, which had been the core of the old Norman kingdom. They also controlled the Duchy of Milan in the north, which was a kind of a strategic crossroads and an economic powerhouse. The Spanish rule was, for the most part, a kind of a quiet and a kind of a very efficient form of administration. The Spanish governors and viceroys were sent to Italy to run the territories, and they did so with a kind of a cold, bureaucratic efficiency. They were not interested in the old Italian rivalries or the old Italian politics. They were interested in one thing: taxes. They wanted to extract the wealth of Italy to fund their endless wars and their vast empire. This meant that Italy, which had been a kind of a center of political and cultural innovation for centuries, was now a kind of a backwater, a kind of a quiet, and a kind of a very boring province of the Spanish Empire. This new political reality had a profound impact on the Italian people. The old urban life, with its intense political conflicts and its fierce sense of civic pride, was a thing of the past. The political energy that had once been channeled into street fights and factionalism was now a kind of a quiet and a kind of a very welcome political apathy. The Italian princes, whether they were the Medici in Tuscany or the popes in Rome, had no choice but to accept the dominance of Spain. They were in a way a kind of a client state, a kind of a puppet of a much larger and a much more powerful ruler. They could still rule their own little territories, but they had to do so with the permission and the help of the King of Spain. The Spanish dominance also had a profound impact on the culture and the art of Italy. The great creative energy of the Renaissance was slowly but surely beginning to fade. The new art was often more formal and more religious, a kind of a reflection of the new political and religious realities. The great patrons of the arts were now the Spanish rulers and the popes, who were more interested in art that was a kind of a grand and a kind of a very formal expression of their power. The world of Leonardo and Michelangelo, with its kind of a raw and its kind of a very humanistic energy, was slowly being replaced by the world of the Baroque, with its kind of a grand and its kind of a very theatrical expressions of faith and power. The papacy, remember, was also going through a kind of a political and a kind of a very spiritual transformation at this time. The scandals of the Renaissance popes had led to the Protestant Reformation, and the Church was now fighting back. The popes of the late 16th century were not the worldly, ambitious princes of the past. They were men who were more interested in piety and in reform. They were, in a way, a kind of a new kind of a pope, a kind of a pope who was more concerned with his spiritual authority than with his temporal power. This new kind of a papacy would be a kind of a major force in the coming of the Counter-Reformation. The old political games were over, and a new kind of a world of great nation-states, and a world of a kind of a new and a kind of a more formal and a kind of a more religious art had taken its place. The political and military dominance of Spain was just one part of a larger transformation happening in Italy. The other great force was a spiritual one. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun in Germany, was a direct and a very public challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church. The Church, which had been so consumed with the worldly politics of the Renaissance, was now forced to react. This reaction was a kind of a grand and a very ambitious movement known as the Counter-Reformation, and Italy, with its close ties to the papacy, was at the very heart of it. The Counter-Reformation was not just a defensive movement, it was also a kind of a moral and a kind of a spiritual reform. The Church, in response to the Protestant challenge, held a series of councils, the most famous of which was the Council of Trent, which was held from 1545 to 1563. The council was a kind of a grand and a very lengthy meeting where the Church reaffirmed its core doctrines and where it also launched a series of reforms. The reforms were aimed at cleaning up the Church and at restoring its moral authority. The sale of indulgences, which had been a kind of a source of so much scandal, was abolished. The education of the clergy was reformed, and a new emphasis was placed on piety and on moral living. The Church also launched a kind of a new and a kind of a very aggressive campaign to win back the souls that it had lost to Protestantism. This was a kind of a spiritual offensive, and it was led by new religious orders, the most famous of which was the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits were a kind of a new kind of a soldier, a kind of a spiritual warrior who was devoted to the service of the Pope and to the propagation of the Catholic faith. They were a kind of a new and a kind of a very effective force in the Counter-Reformation. They were teachers, missionaries, and scholars, and they were very good at what they did. The Counter-Reformation had a profound impact on the culture and the art of Italy. The popes and the Italian princes, who were all staunchly Catholic, became great patrons of a new kind of a religious art, a kind of a very emotional and a very theatrical art that was designed to inspire piety and to win back the hearts of the people. This was the era of the Baroque, a kind of a grand and a kind of a very dramatic style that was a perfect fit for the Counter-Reformation. The great churches of Rome, with their magnificent frescoes and their kind of very dramatic sculptures, were all part of this new artistic movement. The art was a kind of a powerful and a kind of a very effective form of propaganda. It was designed to show the people that the Catholic Church was still the true and the rightful church, and that it was still a source of beauty and of truth. The political and the religious shifts of this era also had a profound impact on the intellectual life of Italy. The great freewheeling spirit of the Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and on classical learning, was slowly but surely being replaced by a new kind of a conservative and a new kind of a more religious spirit. The new intellectual energy was channeled into theology and into religious polemics, and the old kind of a secular and a kind of a very worldly learning was now a kind of a bit suspect. The church, which had been a kind of a great patron of the arts and the sciences, was now a kind of a very cautious and a kind of a very conservative institution. It was afraid of new ideas, and it was very willing to use the Inquisition to enforce its will. This was a kind of a quiet, but a very important shift, a kind of a final and a kind of a very important chapter in the long and complicated story of Italy. The country, which had been so diverse and so open, was now a kind of a bastion of Catholic and a kind of a very conservative power. Historians still argue about whether the Counter-Reformation was a genuine religious revival or if it was simply a political and a kind of a very conservative reaction to the Protestant Reformation. The truth is probably a mix of both. The Church, with its new and its very effective reforms, was able to win back a great deal of the souls that it had lost. But it did so at a very high price, a price that would have a kind of a very profound and a kind of a very lasting impact on the intellectual and the cultural life of Italy. The new conservative atmosphere of the Counter-Reformation, with its emphasis on piety and on religious orthodoxy, would have a profound and a kind of a very chilling effect on the intellectual and the scientific life of Italy. The great freewheeling spirit of the Renaissance, with its open inquiry and its kind of a worldly curiosity, was slowly but surely being replaced by a kind of a new and a kind of a very cautious and a very dogmatic spirit. The Church, which had been a kind of a great patron of the arts and the sciences, was now a kind of a very vigilant and a very suspicious institution, and no one embodied this new reality more than the great scientist Galileo Galilei. Galileo was a man who, in a way, was born a little too late. He was an astronomer, a physicist, and a kind of a very brilliant and a very curious man who lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. He was a kind of a final, magnificent gasp of the Renaissance spirit of open inquiry and of a kind of a very worldly curiosity. He was the first person to use a telescope to look at the night sky, and he made a series of truly remarkable discoveries. He discovered the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the sunspots. His discoveries were a kind of a profound and a very direct challenge to the old Aristotelian view of the universe, which held that the earth was at the center of the universe and that the sun and the planets revolved around it in a series of perfect crystalline spheres. Galileo, with his new and his very brilliant discoveries, became a very vocal and a very public advocate for the new Copernican view of the universe, which held that the sun, not the earth, was at the center of the solar system. This was a kind of a profound and a kind of a very dangerous idea, a kind of a challenge, not just to the old scientific tradition, but also to the old theological tradition. The Church, with its new and its very conservative spirit, saw Galileo's ideas as a kind of a direct and a very public challenge to its authority. It was a kind of a final and a kind of a very public showdown between the old religious order and the new scientific order. The Church was not going to give up its power and its authority without a fight. Galileo was brought before the Inquisition in 1633, and he was forced to recant his ideas. He was a kind of a tragic figure, a kind of a man who was forced to choose between his conscience and his life. He chose to recant, and he was sentenced to a kind of a permanent house arrest. He was a kind of a warning to anyone who thought that a person's intellect and a person's curiosity were enough to challenge the power of the Church. The trial of Galileo was a kind of a final and a kind of a very public demonstration that the old freewheeling spirit of the Renaissance was over. The Church, with its new and its very conservative spirit, was going to be a kind of a very powerful and very vigilant and a very dangerous force. The story of Galileo is a kind of a final and a kind of a very important chapter in the long and complicated story of medieval Italy. It was a kind of a final and a kind of a very dramatic end to the great creative energy of the Renaissance. The country, which had been so diverse and so open, was now a kind of a bastion of Catholic and a kind of a very conservative power. The old political games were over, and a new kind of a world of great nation states, and a world of a kind of a new and a kind of a more formal and a kind of a more religious art had taken its place. The spirit of open inquiry and of a kind of a very worldly curiosity, which had been a kind of a source of so much energy and so much creativity, was now a thing of the past. The country, which had been the birthplace of the Renaissance, was now a kind of a quiet and a kind of a very conservative place. It was a world that in a way was less exciting and less chaotic, but it was also a world that was in a way much more stable. The story of medieval Italy is a long, slow, and a little bit messy one. It began with the quiet fall of the Roman Empire and the arrival of the Goths and the Lombards, who created a kind of a patchwork of power that was a far cry from the old unified Roman state. But this political fragmentation, which seemed like a kind of a failure, was in fact a kind of a necessary and a kind of a very important step towards a new kind of a political and a new kind of a social order. It allowed the cities, with their old Roman foundations and their new commercial energy, to develop their own unique and their own very vibrant forms of self-governance. The rise of the communes and the great maritime republics was a kind of a radical and a kind of a very exciting political experiment that was unlike anything else that was happening in the rest of Europe. The people of the cities were not just subjects of a distant lord or a distant emperor. They were citizens of their own little republics, and they were fiercely proud of their own unique and their own very special identities. This political and this social dynamism was also the engine that would drive one of the most remarkable cultural and artistic periods in all of human history. The Renaissance, with its new humanist ideal and its kind of a worldly curiosity, was a kind of a direct and a kind of a very beautiful product of the political and the social realities of the Italian cities. The great wealth of the merchants and the bankers who had risen to power through their own efforts was channeled into a kind of a new and a kind of a very glorious form of patronage. The art and the architecture that we see in the cities of Florence and Venice and Rome today are a kind of a direct and a kind of a very profound testament to this great flowering of human creativity. The works of men like Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael are not just works of art, they are also a kind of a walking and a kind of a very profound historical document, a kind of a direct and a very powerful expression of the spirit of the age. The era of the independent city-states, with its kind of a fierce and its kind of a very exciting energy, would eventually come to an end. It was a kind of a final and a kind of a very beautiful chapter in the long story of medieval Italy. The Italian wars, with their new and their very destructive armies, were a kind of a brutal and a very public reminder that the old political order was over. The great unified nation-states of Europe, with their powerful armies and their ambition, were simply too much for the fragmented and the kind of a very quarrelsome Italian states to handle. The peninsula, which had been a kind of center of political and cultural innovation for centuries, was now a kind of a pawn in a much larger and a much more dangerous game. The legacy of medieval Italy, however, is not a kind of a sad and a kind of a very tragic one. It is a kind of a very powerful and a kind of a very inspiring one. The ideas of republicanism, of a kind of a new and a kind of a very worldly spirit of inquiry, and of a kind of a new and a kind of a very powerful form of art, would all go on to have a profound and a kind of a very lasting impact on the rest of Europe. The Italian Renaissance, which was born out of the chaos and the change of the medieval era, would in a way be the kind of a beautiful and the kind of a very powerful engine that would drive the rest of Europe into the modern world. The story of medieval Italy is, in a way, a kind of a quiet and a kind of a very slow journey towards a new kind of a world that was in a way more complicated and more dangerous, but also a world that was in a way more creative and more free. The final chapter in this long and this very complicated sentence is about to be written. The long, slow story of medieval Italy has come to its close, but its legacy is not a thing of the past. The political fragmentation that began with the Lombards and led to the fierce independence of the city-states would in a way be a kind of a precursor to the modern nation-state. The ideas of republicanism, of a kind of a messy, but a kind of a very passionate self-governance, would be an inspiration for a new generation of political thinkers. The rise of a new kind of a moneyed class, a class that was not bound by the old feudal traditions, would be a kind of a blueprint for the modern commercial world. The great creative energy of the Renaissance, which was born out of the chaos and the change of the medieval era, would be a kind of a cultural engine that would drive the rest of Europe into the modern world. The art and the architecture, the literature and the philosophy that were produced in this long, quiet, and a little bit sleepy period would have a kind of a profound and a kind of a very lasting impact on the world. The world of Machiavelli, with its kind of a raw and its kind of a very pragmatic political ideas, would in a way be a kind of a guide to the new rulers of the modern era. The world of Galileo, with its kind of a new and its kind of a very scientific spirit, would be a kind of a final and a kind of a very important chapter in the long and complicated story of a world that was slowly but surely waking up to the light of the modern age. The great, long, and a little bit complicated sentence of medieval Italy is now at an end. It began with the quiet fall of an empire, and it ended with the beginning of a new kind of a world. And so, the story of a long and a very tangled history has come to its close. The long journey is over, and the great names and places of a bygone age are now just whispers in the quiet of the night. The fierce Guelphs and the staunch Ghibellines have long since found their rest. The great walls of the ancient cities, the bustling marketplaces, and the grand, soaring cathedrals now stand silent in the moonlight. The distant hoofbeats of Charlemagne's horse fade into the hum of the ages, and the brilliant, sometimes ruthless minds of the Renaissance, those who dreamt and built a new world, have all become part of a larger story now. The long, slow breathing of history continues, but for tonight, you can let go. The tangled story of a forgotten time and a forgotten people has come to an end. It is time to let the mind be still and to let the gentle stillness of the past wash over you, just as a soft fog drifts over the quiet hills of Tuscany at dawn. Close your eyes, and as the final words are spoken, let the soft blanket of sleep begin to settle over you, warm and deep. And so, the story of a long and a very beautiful history comes to a close. End of script. Sweet dreams.